Hey everyone, it's Gerrit. This week we're taking a step back from the stories of Canada's past and places that we often explore on Canada Explained, because I really wanted to talk about something, or rather someone, that's come up on the news both here in Canada and the United States. And at the same time, I want to talk a little about the Canadian political system, and to share some information about some of Canada's darker chapters. As you can tell, I'm incredibly proud to be a Canadian. But there are truths of our history that some people either refuse to believe, or they acknowledge and choose to ignore. There is some deep-seated racism in that history, and we need to be more comfortable talking about it, or else we're never going to do anything about it. So today, I want to tell you the story of Lynn Beyak, Canada's worst senator. Let me start our story here, center block of Parliament Hill. This is the place where our elected politicians come to make decisions, run the government, and so the hard work of passing laws gets done here, right? Well, yes and no. First, let's get some basics. Ottawa is the federal capital, where the Canadian government sits. The feds make decisions about things like going to war, embassies and diplomats, and global climate change. You know, stuff for all of Canada to deal with. And then each province and territory has its own government and their own legislature, like this gorgeous building in Victoria, BC, that runs things on a provincial level, like hospitals, schools, roads, and even how cities are managed. This is why you see more Ontario and British Columbia logos in your school or your local hospital, but you'll see more Canada logos at border crossings, passport offices, and stuff like that. So back to Ottawa. Inside Parliament, there are 3 levels of power. Why? Well, because we have a queen and we like complicated British traditions in our politics for some reason. First, on the left side of Centre Block, there is the House of Commons in the Green Chamber. This is where the people that we actually elect come to work, and there are 338 of them. Right now, our Prime Minister is Justin Trudeau, which, unlike the American president, is not directly elected by everyone in Canada, but is just the leader of the political party that manages to get the most of those 338 seats. Then, on the right side of Centre Block is one of those weird British traditions, the Senate, in the Red Chamber, which is made up of 105 senators, all of whom are nominated directly by a Prime Minister. This is supposed to be this chamber of smart, old, sophisticated, and successful people that represent a sense of wisdom and experience in government. A sober second thought, if you would, because apparently the people elected by regular folks aren't good enough. So any law, once it gets passed on this side, has to go over to this side, where the non-elected old wise people can take it apart and vote on it before passing it on to the Governor General, who represents Queen Elizabeth here in Canada, because she also happens to be the Queen of Australia, New Zealand, Jamaica, and the United Kingdom, of course. The building was closed in 2019. The Senate by design is supposed to be an overseer for the... Anyways, I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole. If you're interested in a more in-depth video on how Canadian government works, I'll put a link in the description to JJ McCullough's video tour of Ottawa and the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. Although I disagree with JJ on a few of his views, especially the role of the French language in Canada and the amount that he wishes we were absorbed into the United States, I do agree with his statement that most Canadians probably think that our senators aren't the wise, successful overseers that they're supposed to be. Senators are not elected by Canadians, rather they're appointed by prime ministers. So even though they exist to be an independent body from the House of Commons, more often than not, they just vote along the same lines as the party that put them there. And these senators have a seat until they either choose to step down or turn 75. And as Senator Beyak's story taught Canada, unless they don't want to leave, there's almost nothing that can be done to force them out. Senator Lynn Beyak was a businesswoman, a former Ontario Progressive Conservative candidate, and a school board trustee with roots in northwestern Ontario. She lives in Dryden, but has a career that spans the whole Sunset District, including Dryden, Kenora, and Fort Frances. In 2013, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper nominated her to the Senate, giving her about 11 potential years in office, and during the time since, Senator Beyak has gotten in trouble for posting racist letters on her website, for being kicked out of racial sensitivity training, and most recently for confusing her address in Dryden, Ontario with the small town of Dryden, New York, just so that she could illegally donate to the 2020 Trump campaign, accidentally. Senator Lynn Beyak is technically my senator. The Senate doesn't designate how many people come from where, but there's a generally agreed upon pattern that usually leaves Ontario with 24 of the 105 seats. And as of right now, she is the only senator that comes from my home region of Northwestern Ontario. I've been to her hometown of Dryden on countless occasions in my life, and I've had the opportunity to meet her on a couple of occasions both at events in Ottawa and while flying between Ottawa and my home airport here in Thunder Bay. Beyak first made real headlines in March of 2017 when she stood in the Senate to make a speech talking about the Indian residential school program. Canada was at the time just starting to really talk about and address one of the darkest chapters of its history. For nearly 150 years, British and then Canadian authorities removed children from their parents and forced them to attend church-run schools. These schools were hotbeds of abuse. Physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, and for decades, Canada hid the existence of these schools. We had started what was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Truth, because reconciliation between Indigenous and settler communities in Canada would only be possible if the truth of what actually happened in our history was shared. Canada needed to sit down and to listen to the stories of its victims, to hear from their mouths what had happened in the schools, and to record this painful history. Make it known to Canadians everywhere, to make it known to settlers, peoples whose families came from elsewhere to Canada, and with whom treaties with Indigenous peoples allowed them to be here. People like me. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission recorded over 6,000 deaths of Indigenous children while they attended the schools for malnutrition, disease, and physical and sexual abuse. This isn't an opinion, this is a fact, and those 6,000 are just the ones they could document. The estimates go higher. I really can't communicate to you the pain of those schools and the lasting intergenerational trauma that continues to exist within Indigenous communities today. That's not my place. There are books, stories, movies written by survivors and intergenerational survivors that can shed more light, and I encourage you to check them out. Titles like Indian Horse come to mind right away. But what I can communicate is just how much truth came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I can show you exactly what the report was, from the executive summary all the way through the volumes of the histories of the books, the experiences of Inuit, Métis communities in the schools, of reconciliation, the legacies, and the burials and unmarked graves of children who died. The stories of the survivors. And if all of what's in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report is a little overwhelming, then I recommend you read this one, A Knock at the Door, The Essential History of Residential Schools. That gives you a brief overview of what all of this is. Senator Beyak stood in the Senate chamber in 2017 and said that just for the record, she wanted to highlight all of the remarkable works, good deeds, and historical tales in the residential schools that go unacknowledged for the most part, and that are overshadowed by what she called the negative reports.
Mistakes were made at residential schools. In many instances, horrible mistakes that overshadowed some good things that also happened at those schools.
In this report, there are some chapters on warm memories, but there are paragraphs compared to the rest, which is filled with abuse, removal, loss of language and culture, what was literally identified as cultural genocide. In what was a spirit of reconciliation in Canada at the time, Senator Beyak missed the mark, and the interim leader of the Conservative Party, Leona Ambrose, kicked her off the Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples when she refused to apologize for her comments. One survivor of the schools and a member of the Sioux Lookout Truth and Reconciliation Committee, Garnet Ange Nikonib, called her comments a huge step backwards and called for her resignation.
I was surprised. I was disappointed and in many ways hurt again in terms of opening up old wounds, if you will.
The longtime advocate for residential school survivors says it's a step backwards.
The senator was asked by some of her colleagues to apologize, but she doubled down, saying that a correction on her position would be an infringement on free speech, which left the other senators feeling dismayed. Tensions continued to boil in the Senate. In this letter, she writes that a small number of Aboriginals found the schools bad, and a slightly smaller number found them good. Only 1 in 3 children ever attended them, and very few were torn from their parents' arms, but rather were enrolled by loving parents who were away trapping and trading for months on end and who wanted to prepare their children for the future. That is in stark contrast to some other things that we see, like this painting. These statements were totally untrue, as made evidenced by this report. She doubled down on her racist tone by proposing that Indigenous Canadians should trade in their treaty rights for a one-time payment and go practice their culture on their own dime. And she defended statues of figures like Sir John A. Macdonald years before the one was torn down this summer in Montreal. This letter was shocking to most people, as it should be. Anyone with a knowledge in Canadian history would understand why this is hurtful, racist, and wrong. The problem is, there are still a lot of people who have not yet been taught this history. My favorite example is that I have younger twin brothers. One's behind the camera making all these cool things happen. I was born in 1995 and they were born in 1999. The history of colonialism in Canada, the residential schools, they were taught about that. I wasn't. Literally anyone my age or older has to learn about this history on their own, and a lot of them haven't yet had that opportunity. Minister Carolyn Bennett, who's the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, said that she was deeply disappointed that the senator continues to provide these uninformed and simply offensive comments for issues which she clearly does not understand. And what is also worrying is that she still won't admit that she has a lot to learn.
I don't need any more education. I've been involved since we double dated when I was 15 with an Aboriginal fellow and his wife.
Once again, we suggest she sit down and listen to some of the survivors of residential schools. They have a great deal to teach her. The Senate removed her from all of her other committees, like Defense, Agriculture, and Transportation, after she posted the letter, and she was apparently given internal guidelines by the Conservative Party on how to act going forward. However, instead she decided to post hundreds of letters of support from Canadians that shared her view on her website. Many who hadn't learned about that history and refused to believe it, and many more that harbored incredibly racist stereotypes about Indigenous Canadians, like being lazy. Some letters were so hateful that other senators were worried that just by Beyak having them on her website, she would be charged with a hate crime for inciting violence against Indigenous communities. The government asked her to take them down, there were calls to boycott any Beyak businesses in Dryden, and the Grand Chiefs of the Anishinaabe-Aski Nation, Grand Council of Treaty 3, and Southern Chiefs of Manitoba all called for her resignation. She dug her heels in and continued posting letters on her site, forcing other senators to start an investigation into her behavior and its compliance with the Senate's Code of Conduct. In January 2018, Andrew Scheer, who had now replaced Stephen Harper and Leona Ambrose as leader of the Conservatives, was facing questions about the letters. He said that he had just learned about them, which we know wasn't true because emails about the senator, including him, went as far back as September. But he did ask her publicly to take them down. When she didn't, she was removed from the Conservative caucus and was no longer a member of the Conservative Party of Canada. But because senators keep their jobs until 75, there was nothing anyone could do to remove her, and she continued to sit in the chamber as an independent. That is until the Code of Conduct investigation was finally completed in March of 2019. Senate ethics officers said that Lynn Beyak violated the upper chamber's Code of Conduct by posting racist letters about Indigenous people on her website, and that she was not upholding the high standards of dignity required of a senator, nor did she refrain from acting in a way that could negatively impact the Senate, as is stipulated in the code. They recommended that she be suspended without pay until the end of the session and that the Senate staff force removal of the letters from her site if she won't do it herself, and that she pay for and attend racial sensitivity training. Later in the summer of 2019, she undertook training from the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres in Toronto on 2 occasions in June and in August. However, she was eventually kicked out of the program. In a report, the training coordinator wrote that the senator is not interested in confronting her ill-informed understandings of the realities of Indigenous people in Canada. They said the senator is not open to learning about Canadian history, Canadian current policies impacting Indigenous people, nor is she willing to even contemplate the shared future inspired by a spirit of reconciliation. They said that her inflexibility and conduct made the learning environment unsafe, for which she was actually asked to leave the premises. She continued to deny the impacts of intergenerational trauma, racism, and colonization. She denied that racism existed in Dryden, and she showed a lack of understanding on basic Canadian history. She literally failed racial sensitivity training, but because of the 2019 election being called and that session of Parliament ending, so did her suspension, and she was back to work by February of this year. When she got back in the spring, she made an apology to the Senate in early 2020 after saying,
"After deep and careful reflection, I have come to the view that the posting of offensive and hurtful letters to a Senate public website was wrong and ill-considered. And my insistence on leaving them up was also wrong. They were disrespectful, divisive, and unacceptable."
Beyak claimed that she met the requirements of the racial sensitivity training and that her apology was enough. But Indigenous leaders thought that it was just for show, and the Senate agreed, especially given that her training went so wrong. So they suspended her again in February of this year until June, and this time they set out who would be giving her the training. A Dr. Jonathan Blackbranch, the former Dean of Law at the University of Manitoba. The Dean gave the senator a 3-day training over Skype and said that she was good to go. Clearly, the reaction to this was not positive. First Nations leaders and residential school survivors in our region, where there were 9 residential schools, had no involvement or input into the curriculum, and they were not involved in her apology to the Senate. One survivor said that the apology should happen in Dryden, in front of members of neighboring communities. Grand Chiefs Francis Kavanagh of Treaty 3 and Alvin Fiddler of the Anishinaabe Nation have both spoken out in recent months about Beyak's continued role as a senator. Anishinaabe lawyer and intergenerational survivor Danielle Morrison said that the call to have Senator Beyak removed from the Senate has been loud and clear. And instead of listening to Indigenous people from the territory that Beyak represents, the people who experience the most harm, someone made the decision that academia knows better. Nonetheless, the Senate agreed with the Dean's assessment, and her suspension was lifted in June of 2020. Since then, she's been able to return to work as a full-time senator with all the perks and privileges that entails for at least another 4 years. That is, unless the coalition to remove Lynn Beyak from the Senate has its way. This person cannot be the old, wise, sober second thought that British tradition thought we needed in Canada. We have to do better. And that could mean making some changes to the Senate so that in some cases senators can be removed, whether that be because of blatant racism, alleged assault, and then housing corruption, or just housing corruption. I mean, Beyak popped up just this October again for creating an imaginary address in Dryden, New York, just to donate to Trump's re-election campaign. And it wasn't even a very good attempt at hiding it either. She used her actual home address, which is on a distinctly northern-sounding road, and claimed it was a New York address when that street doesn't even exist down in the state at all. It is literally illegal for people without US citizenship or permanent residency to donate to an American presidential campaign. And so she broke the law to do that. And no, we don't believe you when you say it was an accident. You have to go on the site and type in your credit card information to do that. I think most Canadians agree that for the most part, our elected officials represent our values to the best of their abilities, and that at the very least, we do have the chance to vote them out every few years if we don't agree with what they're doing. But that's not what the Senate is. And in my opinion, it kind of fails to represent the diversity of communities and experiences that exist in this country, at least to the same level that the 338-member House of Commons does. I don't know. I don't quite have a solution to the Senate problem. I just know that I wanted to speak out as someone from Northwestern Ontario to say that Senator Beyak does not represent us. I feel ashamed when she comes up in the news or when I see her at the airport because to me, she represents the Canada that is willingly refusing to let go of its own racism. When we hear her name, people elsewhere in the country think, oh yeah, it's just another one of those racists in Northern Ontario. And yeah, there is some deeply rooted racism in Dryden and in Thunder Bay and everywhere else in this region. Tensions here are higher than they are other places in Canada, and so to pretend that that's not true is to be willfully ignorant. We are a microcosm of Canada's racism. It's a place where it becomes easy to see. Heck, that's why Canada Land is about to put out a second season of a podcast on racism in this city. To me, she represents the worst senator in Canada, because she represents the worst in Canada. And I don't know how to feel about it. I want to speak up, I want to make change to build a better country, but people like her are still in power and they're going to be until they're 75. I know that there's a lot to unpack there, but I would love to hear what you have to say about the Senate, about racism in your community, about anything that I've had to say, Canada's history. You know, here at Canada Explained, we're really excited to be bringing you stories about interesting places and stories and pieces of our past, but a part of that includes talking about some of the darker chapters too. And I think that's really important. So I appreciate you all for being here, for making it this long through the video. Like I said, if you want to learn anything more about it, check out Indian Horse, read A Knock at the Door, and as always, we'll see you next time.